My name is Sarah, I am 32 years old, and this happened to me. I arrived at the vineyard holding Michael's hand, our fingers barely touching. There was no warmth between us anymore, just the performance of a couple still playing their roles. The vineyard stretched under the California sun like a painting, lush green vines, blooming white roses lining the aisle, and golden light dancing off crystal flutes filled with champagne. Emily had outdone herself. My younger sister had always been the dreamer in the family, the one who believed in fairy tales and soulmates. Today was her big moment, and she looked every bit the part of a bride out of a magazine. I stood by her side, smiling when the photographer turned my way, adjusting my expression with the precision of someone who had learned to wear masks. Michael, on the other hand, stood slightly behind me, his hand slipping from mine every chance it got. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, how he kept glancing at his phone, checking his watch, nodding absently at the guests who passed us with hugs and congratulations. He had mastered the art of appearing present while being miles away. The ceremony began as expected. Emily walked down the aisle with Dad, her veil floating in the breeze like something out of a movie. There were tears, soft gasps from the crowd, flashes from cameras. I tried to feel something, anything, but my chest was hollow. Michael leaned in once during the vows to whisper something about the decorations. I nodded without listening. I couldn't bring myself to care about centerpieces or candle arrangements. I was too busy noticing how far away Michael felt, even as he stood right beside me. There was a moment, just after Emily and her new husband kissed, when the music swelled and everyone clapped, that I turned to Michael and tried to smile. He didn't look at me. He was scanning the crowd, eyes darting over familiar faces, lips pressed into a line. When our eyes finally met, he blinked, surprised, as if I'd interrupted a thought he didn't want to share. I turned away quickly, pretending to adjust my dress, but inside, I felt a ripple, something between dread and certainty. At the reception, everything sparkled. Lights strung between the trees, long tables covered in ivory linens, laughter echoing like music. But even with all that beauty, I felt like I didn't belong. Not to the party, not to the marriage, not even to the version of myself I was pretending to be. Michael stayed close but said little. He chatted with friends, smiled politely, raised his glass when expected. But not once did he reach for me. Not once did he ask how I was holding up. And in those tiny absences, I began to feel the weight of something much larger. Still, I played along. I smiled for photos. I toasted with my glass raised. I nodded as strangers told me how lucky Emily was to have such a beautiful wedding. But underneath, I was unraveling. I couldn't stop thinking about the way Michael kept glancing over his shoulder, or how he seemed to light up only when he was away from me. Something was wrong. And though I had no proof yet, I knew. I had seen it in the way he kissed my cheek that morning, soft, obligatory, like he was kissing someone he had already said goodbye to. I had felt it in the silence between us during the car ride to the venue, where he had scrolled through his phone while I stared out the window. There was a crack running through our life, and no one else seemed to notice. But I did. I watched Emily and her new husband dance under the stars, their hands interlocked, their foreheads touching. Everyone around them seemed so happy, so full of belief in beginnings. I wanted to believe too. But I had already started mourning something that hadn't ended yet. That night, in the middle of the applause and laughter, I realized I was alone, even as my husband stood inches from me. The reception had settled into a soft rhythm, champagne flowing, guests laughing, the sun beginning to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows over the vineyard. Sarah sat quietly at the head table beside Michael, her posture perfect, hands folded over her lap. From a distance, they looked like the perfect couple. Up close, something had shifted. There was space between them, not physical but palpable, like a silence neither wanted to break. Michael stood abruptly. His glass in hand, he tapped it with a fork. The room quieted. People turned to him with the expectant smiles they reserve for grooms or best men. Even Emily paused mid-laugh, glancing toward her brother-in-law with mild curiosity. Sarah didn't move. She stared straight ahead, eyes locked on some invisible point beyond the guests. I just wanted to say a few words, Michael began, his voice calm, measured. It's been a beautiful day. Emily, you've created something magical here. It's rare to see love celebrated so honestly. There were murmurs of agreement, nods from the guests. But, he said, and the word struck like the sudden crack of a branch snapping underfoot, this day has made me reflect on honesty, and how sometimes, love means making hard choices. Sarah blinked once. That was all. Michael cleared his throat. I've been living a lie, he said, and the murmurs stopped completely. Not just to myself. To someone who didn't deserve it. Sarah. Every eye turned to her. She didn't flinch. Michael continued. I think it's time we stop pretending. Sarah and we're no longer in the same story. I've met someone else. And I'm leaving this marriage. No one moved. For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was the distant clink of silverware dropped by a stunned waiter. Claire sat still at her table, her gaze fixed on the center of her plate. She didn't smile, didn't fidget. But Sarah saw it, the way Claire's shoulders tensed just slightly, like a dancer who knows her cue is coming but dreads the spotlight. Michael didn't say her name. He didn't need to. Half the room was already turning toward Claire. Sarah looked directly at her. She didn't cry. Didn't gasp. Didn't speak. But in that silence, her eyes said everything. People who had known Sarah for years would later say they had never seen her so composed. It was almost unnatural. Like she had rehearsed this moment in her mind over and over again. Perhaps she had. Michael looked down after he spoke, as if ashamed, but Sarah suspected it was something else, fear, maybe. Of what came next. Emily was frozen beside her husband. Her hand slowly reached for Sarah's, but she stopped short, unsure if comfort was appropriate or if it would simply shatter what little strength Sarah seemed to be holding on to. A cough somewhere in the back broke the spell. Sarah rose to her feet. She didn't touch Michael. Didn't even glance at him. Her eyes were still on Claire. She walked slowly, deliberately, the sound of her heels sharp against the polished wood floor. She reached for her clutch from the chair and turned toward the exit. Everyone assumed she was leaving. Even Michael relaxed a little, his body sinking slightly, like he thought the worst had passed. But Sarah stopped. She turned to face him, now at a distance, now with the attention of the entire vineyard. She held something in her hand. An envelope. And with the same quiet composure that had followed her every step, she walked back to him and held it out. Michael stared at it like it might explode. There was a flicker of confusion, followed by the kind of smirk that only arrogant men wear when they believe they still control the narrative. He took the envelope. "What's this?" he asked, the smirk deepening. Sarah didn't answer. She simply stepped back, her expression unreadable. Michael opened it casually, as if expecting a letter, or maybe a dramatic farewell note he could later dismiss. What he pulled out wasn't a letter. It was paperwork. A thick stack of it. He began to flip through the pages, then slowed. His fingers tightened. His eyes narrowed. A single word slipped from his lips, barely audible, "No." And then louder, sharper. "Sarah." The name cracked through the silence like a gunshot. People turned again. Sarah had already turned her back. She walked toward the door, leaving behind her marriage, her past, and a vineyard full of witnesses frozen in disbelief. The air inside the vineyard reception hall had changed. The moment Sarah handed Michael the envelope, it was as if someone had sucked all the oxygen out of the room. No one moved. No one spoke. People were still holding champagne flutes midair, forks frozen halfway to their mouths, expressions suspended between shock and disbelief. The silence was not empty, it was thick, loud, like a scream without sound. Michael's voice echoed, "Sarah," but it was too late. She didn't turn back. Claire, seated among the guests who were once mutual friends, slowly lowered her gaze to her lap. The confidence she had worn like perfume all night was gone. Her hands trembled slightly on the tablecloth. A napkin crumpled in her palm. She knew. She knew that everyone knew. Some guests glanced toward her, others pretended not to. but no one reached out. Not one person leaned over to whisper comfort. Claire was an island now, surrounded, but alone. Sarah walked through the crowd with an unnatural calm, like the eye of a storm, untouched while everything around her shattered. She did not rush. She did not falter. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor like punctuation marks to a sentence no one was ready to hear. She reached the coat check without looking back. Behind her, murmurs began to ripple like aftershocks. The spell of silence had broken. People were whispering, shifting in their chairs, exchanging glances. Michael remained near the microphone, the opened envelope in his hand, staring at the papers as though they might catch fire. His face had drained of color. He tried to speak again, but the words caught in his throat. A man near the bar muttered, "What the hell was that?" "Did he just confess to cheating at his sister-in-law's wedding?" someone whispered. Another voice, sharper, female, "That's Claire. She's the other woman." Claire flinched at the sound of her name, though no one had spoken it directly. Her presence had gone from unnoticed to unbearable. She reached for her purse but didn't rise. Leaving now would mean acknowledging the spotlight had finally found her. At the far end of the room, Emily stood. Her veil had been removed, her makeup slightly smudged from earlier tears of joy, now soured by confusion and anger. Her new husband looked helpless beside her, his arm halfway around her waist, unsure if he should stay quiet or demand answers. Emily's gaze bounced between Michael, the envelope, and the door where her sister had disappeared. Then she looked at Claire. And Claire looked away. Sarah stepped outside into the cool evening air. The vineyard smelled of lavender and oak and something older, like the silence between storm clouds. Her parents followed, calling her name softly, unsure whether to ask questions or simply be there. They had no idea. None of them had. That was the most brilliant part of Sarah's silence. It was her armor, her weapon, her strategy. While everyone assumed she was blissfully unaware, she had been preparing. At the car, she stopped. Her father caught up first. "Sarah," he said gently, "what happened?" She turned toward him, finally allowing her expression to shift, just slightly. "Nothing that wasn't already happening," she said. Her mother came next, her voice trembling. "Did you know?" Sarah nodded once. "For a while." "But, why today?" her father asked, still trying to grasp the edges of the truth. "Because today," Sarah said, "he gave me the microphone." Inside, Michael still stood, holding the pages, eyes darting across lines he hadn't read in full before. There were transaction logs. Recorded conversations. Names of banks, accounts, documents filed under Sarah's name, but not with her consent. He had used her. Not just emotionally, but financially, legally. The business he built with Claire, the one she believed was a distant passion project, had been tied to her from the beginning. Now it was public. Someone approached him. A groomsman. "Mike, what is this?" Michael didn't answer. He dropped the papers onto the nearest table, suddenly aware of how many eyes were watching him now, not with admiration, not with sympathy, but with suspicion. He took a step toward Claire's table. She finally stood, sensing his movement. "Don't," she said under her breath, her voice tight. Michael reached for her arm. "We need to talk." Claire pulled back. "Here? Now? Are you insane?" "You knew this would come out," he hissed. "I didn't know she knew," Claire snapped. "You said, not here," Michael cut her off, too loud. A few guests turned. His voice was cracking, too raw now to control. "We'll fix this." Claire stared at him, then at the papers. She shook her head. "No," she said. "You'll try to fix it. I'm leaving." And she did. She walked toward the back, toward the parking lot, passing guests who moved out of her way without a word. No one stopped her. Michael remained alone, gripping a chair, watching the only ally he had disappear into the dark. Outside, Sarah sat in the back seat of her parents' car. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. Her mother placed a hand over hers and left it there. The vineyard faded behind them in the rearview mirror, a monument to a moment that would never be forgotten. And inside it, the shame began to settle. He hadn't expected the envelope. Not there. Not then. Michael had rehearsed his announcement in the mirror of a hotel bathroom that morning, testing different tones, searching for a way to make himself look honest, even noble. He had envisioned shocked faces, of course, anger, betrayal, but nothing that would last. He believed in his own charm, in the forgiveness of time, and in Claire. Claire, who promised him a better life than the one he had grown tired of with Sarah. But what he had not rehearsed for, what had never crossed his mind, was that Sarah would come prepared. The envelope had weight. It wasn't just paper, it was evidence, heavy and deliberate, like a weapon disguised in bureaucracy. When he opened it, the smirk on his face faltered almost immediately. At first, he thought it was some form of melodramatic farewell, perhaps a final attempt to humiliate him publicly. But as he flipped through the pages, his fingers began to tremble. Bank statements. Dozens of them. All linked to accounts he had created using Sarah's personal information. Business filings under her name. Transfer records. Audio transcripts, Sarah had labeled them meticulously. One caught his eye first. A wire transfer for $130,000 made to a consulting firm that never existed. The listed contact was Claire. He looked up, breath caught in his throat. The room was too quiet, too many eyes on him. He scanned the faces for something to anchor him, but all he saw was the slow realization spreading like a stain in water. People were putting the pieces together. Claire had already left. He turned in place, slowly, like a man trapped in a dream-turned-nightmare. The envelope was still in his hand, but it felt like it was burning. He didn't know how many copies Sarah had made. He didn't know who had already seen them. At the edge of the room, the wedding planner whispered something into her assistant's ear and disappeared into the kitchen. The DJ stopped the music entirely, unsure whether this was a brief interruption or the collapse of the evening. Michael grabbed the nearest empty chair and sat down. The weight of everything was settling into his chest. He flipped to another page. A copy of an email. His own words to Claire. She suspects nothing. We'll move everything by end of month. The timestamp was from 3 weeks ago. How? How had Sarah known? That question turned in his mind like a screw. He had been careful, at least, he thought he had. He used burner phones, fake domains, quiet transfers. Claire had handled most of the routing. She had said Sarah would never dig deep. That she wasn't that type of woman. But clearly, Claire didn't know her at all. Sarah had been digging for months. Quietly. Strategically. And now, in front of everyone he knew, in the place where he expected to make a clean break and walk away into a new life, she had flipped the script. She had taken his moment and turned it into hers. Someone tapped his shoulder. It was Emily. "What the hell is going on?" she asked, voice low and tight. Michael turned toward her, tried to speak, but his throat was dry. She glanced at the documents still splayed on his lap. She didn't reach for them. She didn't need to. Her eyes said everything. "You used her," she whispered, horror blooming on her face. "You used my sister." Michael opened his mouth, but Emily didn't wait. She turned and walked away, fast, leaving her own wedding behind. He was unraveling now. Every person in the room could see it. The tidy, confident man from earlier was gone. In his place sat someone hollowed out by exposure. Outside, Sarah stood under the olive trees that lined the gravel driveway. Her parents had followed her, offering support, confusion, and space in equal measure. She refused the car. She wasn't ready to leave just yet. Not until she heard it. And she did. Through the open windows of the reception hall, she heard Michael yell her name. Not once, but twice. Then silence. Then murmurs. She could imagine the scene even without seeing it, the stack of documents in his lap, the guests leaning closer, whispers blooming like wildfire. Her heart was steady. No adrenaline, no fear. Just clarity. She had waited for this moment. She had earned it. Sarah turned to her father. "Take Mom home," she said. "I'll follow you in a bit." "You're sure?" he asked. She nodded. "I just want a few more minutes." He hesitated. Then squeezed her hand. "I'm proud of you," he said softly. When they drove away, she walked slowly back toward the hall, not to enter, not to confront. Just to listen. The voices had changed. There was no more laughter, no more toasts. Only fragments of conversation drifting through the walls. Words like fraud, arrest, investigation. Sarah smiled. Just once. Then turned and walked away into the night, the echo of her footsteps fading into the gravel. Inside, Michael was still holding the envelope. But the truth was no longer his to control. There were 37 pages inside the envelope. Michael counted them later, alone in a hotel room he had booked under a false name. The room smelled like disinfectant and artificial lemon, with cheap blinds that rattled in the wind. But even surrounded by the hollow comfort of anonymity, he couldn't stop looking at the documents. Every page felt like a nail in the coffin of the life he had tried to build on lies. The first page was a bank statement, his name nowhere on it. Only Sarah's. An account he had opened 18 months prior, routed through a small bank in Arizona, one he thought was too obscure to attract attention. But Sarah had found it. And she had highlighted every transaction linked to the consulting firm he created with Claire. Tens of thousands of dollars moved in patterns that looked random, but weren't. Sarah had drawn lines between them with red pen, dates, and notes in her handwriting. It was meticulous. The second page was a recorded transcript. A conversation between Michael and a man named Harris. Sarah had labeled it, "Call, Legal Structure Advice, August 12th. In it, Michael could be heard asking how to register a business using someone else's identity, hypothetically, of course. Harris had been hesitant, offering vague replies, but the tone of Michael's voice was unmistakable, confident, cavalier, and damning. Then came the incorporation documents. The business, Cascade Meridian Ventures, had been registered under Sarah's full name, using her social security number, her old California address, even her birth date. A perfect match. Michael had forged her signature, but only subtly, close enough that it could pass in most places. He had gambled on her never noticing. On her trust. On her distractions. And he had lost. Sarah had even included digital copies of emails between Michael and Claire, lifted from an old iPad he forgot was synced to his cloud account. One thread in particular had been flagged with a sticky note, planning transfer, November 3rd. In it, Claire had written, "Once the last funds are moved, we disappear. She'll never know. You promised." Sarah had added nothing to that note. The words spoke loudly enough. One of the final pages was a notarized statement from a private investigator. Sarah had hired him 6 months ago. He had followed Michael. Recorded him. Taken photographs of meetings between him and Claire at a leased office space downtown, an address listed on the fraudulent business registration. He had traced travel records, Airbnb rentals, and flagged transactions that linked the couple's movements across cities. Michael realized now that Sarah had known everything long before that day in the vineyard. She had simply chosen when to reveal it. But perhaps the most damning piece came at the very end. A letter. Typed. Short. Addressed to the district attorney's office. It outlined her allegations. Identity theft. Financial fraud. Conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Sarah had not yet filed it officially, but she had signed and dated it. The implication was clear: if he contested the divorce, if he attempted to retaliate, if he tried to shift blame, she would press charges. And with this amount of documentation, she wouldn't just win. He would go to prison. Michael sat back in the Hart Hotel chair, staring at the papers fanned out across the table. His hands trembled, not from fear exactly, but from the crumbling realization that Sarah had outmaneuvered him completely. He had thought she was weak. He had mistaken her silence for blindness, her composure for fragility. He had assumed she would collapse, retreat, or rage, anything but this quiet, strategic detonation of everything he had built. And she hadn't even stayed to watch it burn. She didn't need to. While Michael replayed every lie he had ever told her, Sarah was elsewhere, letting the truth do her speaking for her. She had printed 4 copies of the envelope's contents. One had gone to Michael. Another was already with her lawyer. A third sat in a safety deposit box she had opened 2 weeks prior under her maiden name. And the fourth had been given to Emily, after the wedding, once the guests had dispersed and the music had stopped. Sarah didn't explain it. She only handed her sister the folder and said, "In case anything happens." Emily didn't ask questions. She simply took it, holding it with both hands as if it were something sacred. Back in the hotel, Michael realized the true brilliance of Sarah's move. It wasn't just the evidence. It was the timing. The location. The audience. By exposing him at Emily's wedding, she had ensured the truth would spread faster than any legal proceeding ever could. Everyone had seen. Everyone had heard. There was no room left for Michael to spin the story. The narrative no longer belonged to him. His phone buzzed once. A message from a blocked number. "Consider this your only warning. Try anything, and I'll release the recordings." He didn't need to ask who had sent it. Michael closed the envelope, slowly, hands cold. Everything inside it was true. And nothing he said from now on would matter more than what Sarah had already proven. The reception never really recovered. After Sarah's exit and Michael's unraveling, the event spiraled into a strange, suspended state, like a party that didn't realize it was over. The music stopped and never returned. The string quartet, unsure of their cue, quietly packed their instruments and slipped out the side gate. Waiters whispered behind silver trays, retreating to the kitchen with uneaten hors d'oeuvres. The celebration had transformed into a courtroom without a trial, a gathering soaked in gossip and caution. Guests remained seated, not out of comfort but paralysis. The silence after Sarah left was deafening, yet it said more than any toast could have. People avoided Michael's gaze. Even the ones who had once laughed with him, shared drinks, toasted his anniversaries, now they averted their eyes. The betrayal had been too public, too precise, and it stained everyone who had ever vouched for him. Emily stood near the head table, arms crossed, her wedding dress suddenly feeling like an unwanted costume. Her face was pale, jaw locked tight. Her new husband hovered at her side, unsure whether to hold her or leave her alone. It was supposed to be her night. A new beginning. But instead, it had become the stage for her sister's reckoning and her brother-in-law's humiliation. She couldn't decide what hurt more, that Michael had done it, or that he'd chosen this day to confess. Her parents had returned from escorting Sarah to the car. Her mother's eyes were red, her father silent. They didn't approach Michael. They didn't ask questions. They simply took seats near the exit, exchanging long, quiet glances that said more than words ever could. Claire tried to slip out during the chaos. She rose from her seat, her purse clutched tightly, eyes darting like a cornered animal. But Emily saw her. So did others. As she walked toward the back gate, one of Emily's college friends stepped into her path, not aggressively, just enough to pause her. "Leaving already?" the friend asked, voice cool. Claire didn't respond. She simply nodded and moved past, her heels clicking against the stone path as she vanished behind a curtain of ivy. The whispers followed her. By then, Michael had sunk into a chair beside the now abandoned microphone. His tie was loosened, his shirt rumpled. The documents from the envelope were still on the table in front of him. At one point, a former friend, a man named Brian, leaned over and said, "You really thought you'd walk away clean?" Michael didn't answer. He had no answers left to give. A woman nearby said, "She knew. She knew all along." That phrase echoed again and again. Guests repeated it like a chant. Sarah's calm had unsettled them. Her silence after Michael's betrayal had been more powerful than any outburst. And that envelope, it had shifted the weight of truth permanently in her favor. By the end of the evening, only a handful of guests remained. Some out of obligation, others out of morbid curiosity. No one danced. No one clinked glasses. The wedding cake sat untouched, the topper of two smiling figures now cruelly ironic. Emily approached Michael only once before leaving. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. "You chose the wrong person to underestimate," she said. Then she turned her back and walked away, the train of her dress trailing behind like a white flame in the dark. The wedding planner tried to salvage something, offering to box the meals, prepare the cake to go, but Emily declined. "Let it rot," she said. As she exited the venue, her husband followed. He didn't say a word, just took her hand. The gesture was small, but enough. Enough to remind her that not everything was broken. Meanwhile, inside, Michael remained in his chair, staring at the envelope as if it might change. But the facts didn't fade. The accusations didn't erase. He was alone now. Claire was gone. Sarah was gone. And everyone else saw him for what he truly was. By the next morning, the story had already spread. Guests posted cryptic messages online, "Weddings always bring surprises, and never seen a takedown like that." A few photos surfaced, Michael's stunned face holding the envelope, Claire's shadow slipping through the garden, Sarah's final steps toward the exit. The images said enough. The narrative was being written without Michael's input. Sarah didn't check her phone that night. She didn't need to. She knew the fallout had begun. And she didn't flinch. She had planned for this. The morning after the wedding, the vineyard was quiet. Tables were still draped in linen, centerpieces wilted slightly from the night air, and ribbons fluttered in silence, ghosts of a celebration that had turned into a scandal. But Sarah wasn't there to see it. She was already 2 hours away, walking into a law office she had visited 3 times before. The receptionist greeted her by name. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Inside, the lawyer, Marianne Doyle, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and sharper instincts, was waiting. The envelope Sarah had handed Michael the night before was only part of the arsenal. The real documentation sat neatly in a binder on Marianne's desk, labeled, "Case File S. Whitmore vs. M. Whitmore." Sarah sat without hesitation. "It's time," she said. Marianne nodded. "We file today. Divorce, asset seizure, restraining orders. Everything's been prepared." Sarah opened her own folder. Inside were USB drives, notarized statements, additional copies of emails and voice recordings, more than enough to justify every legal action. She had been building this for weeks, step by step, move by move, while Michael went about his affair with confidence, believing her silence meant ignorance. She had discovered everything by accident. It had started with a piece of mail, an insurance statement addressed to her in a name she didn't recognize. When she called the number on the document, they confirmed her business was in good standing. But Sarah had never opened a business. That was the beginning. Instead of confronting Michael immediately, she had waited. Pretended. She changed nothing in her behavior. She played the loyal wife. But privately, she hired Marianne, hired an investigator, and began quietly separating her financial identity from his. She moved certain accounts, locked down her credit, transferred sentimental assets into protected accounts, photos, heirlooms, her grandmother's ring. Every dinner they shared after that, every vacation day, every car ride, was part of her performance. She memorized his patterns. She knew which emails he deleted, how he avoided leaving a digital trail, how he sometimes spoke in code to Claire, using vague phrases like phase 2 and disengagement. He thought he was clever. He didn't realize Sarah had backed up their shared cloud months ago and set up alerts for any file activity. Now, at Marianne's office, everything was converging. Sarah had compiled proof that Michael had not only cheated emotionally, but had committed multiple crimes using her identity. Wire fraud. Identity theft. Tax evasion. The law was not just on her side, it was already positioned to strike. Marianne slid a document across the table. "Once this is signed, we freeze the accounts." Sarah read the page, every line clear. Joint assets would be flagged. Any properties acquired during the fraud would be held in trust until litigation. Michael wouldn't be able to touch a dollar without it being noticed. She signed. Do we notify him now? Marianne asked. Sarah shook her head. He's probably still trying to get his story straight. Let him scramble. Marianne leaned back, studying her. You really held your ground. Sarah didn't respond right away. Her eyes drifted to the window behind Marianne's desk. The sun was rising, full and bright, over a skyline that had nothing to do with weddings or Michael or Claire. It was a clean view. Untouched. I didn't just want revenge, Sarah finally said. I wanted peace. And this was the beginning of it. Later that afternoon, she drove to the bank personally. With the legal filings in hand, she sat across from a branch manager and requested a freeze on all joint assets pending divorce proceedings. The manager hesitated until she handed him the court order Marianne had filed hours earlier. That hesitation vanished. Within minutes, access was locked. Michael wouldn't know until his card declined. At another branch, she retrieved the safety deposit box. Inside were copies of every critical document, plus a personal letter she'd written to herself months ago. It read, "When you read this, you'll be free. Don't look back." She didn't. At home, Sarah began packing, not in a rush, but with focus. She wasn't leaving out of fear or shame. She was reclaiming space. Clothing went into boxes. Books she loved. Photos of her family, only the ones that didn't include him. She deleted old emails, backed up her files, contacted her accountant. Then she made one final call. Claire's employer. Michael had used Claire's name in several of the fraudulent transactions. Sarah had evidence of her participation, emails sent from Claire's work address, late-night messages that referenced account movements. She didn't need to send everything. Just enough to spark suspicion. She sent an anonymous tip with attachments. Not to destroy Claire, but to remind her that complicity had consequences. Sarah never heard back. She didn't need to. By evening, her new apartment was ready. A one-bedroom in a quiet building near the park. Nothing extravagant, just enough space for her and the new life she had chosen. That night, she didn't cry. She didn't scroll through old photos. She didn't play sad songs or pour wine or write in a journal. She simply lay on the couch and let silence fill the room, not the cold silence of betrayal, but the calm silence of finally being in control. Michael didn't know his accounts were frozen until the gas station declined his card. It was late, nearly midnight, and he was driving back from Claire's apartment, which now felt more like a hideout than a home. He stared at the terminal in disbelief, tried the card again, then another. Declined. He stepped out of line, murmuring apologies, his voice thin with humiliation. In the car, he opened his banking app. Nothing. Balance unavailable. A red banner, account access suspended, contact your financial institution. He called the bank. The voice on the line was polite but firm. Due to ongoing legal proceedings, your accounts have been placed on temporary hold pending verification of ownership and fraud investigation. He dropped the phone. The following morning, he woke to a knock on the door of the apartment Claire had once sublet. She was gone. The place looked like she'd never lived there. No clothes, no toothbrush, no notes. Just a bare mattress, a glass on the counter, and silence. He answered the door disheveled, hoping it wasn't a neighbor. It was a process server. Michael Whitmore? The man asked. Michael nodded. You've been served. The man handed him 2 envelopes, one for divorce, the other a legal summons regarding fraudulent business activity. Michael barely heard the explanation. The word that echoed in his ears was fraud. He opened the envelope right there in the doorway. Inside was a detailed document outlining the charges being reviewed: identity theft, misuse of marital assets, unreported income, fraudulent registration of a business using stolen personal data. All with exhibits attached. He sat down on the floor, back against the wall, breathing hard. Claire wasn't answering his calls. Her number rang twice, then straight to voicemail. He tried texting, nothing. Social media? Gone. Deleted. She had vanished overnight. He drove to her workplace, only to be stopped at the lobby. She no longer works here, the receptionist said without looking up. How long ago? He asked. The woman paused, then replied, she resigned this morning. Claire had jumped ship before it could sink. He tried going to the bank in person. Maybe he could reason with someone, explain things, convince them it was all a misunderstanding. But when he gave his name at the desk, the banker looked uncomfortable. I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore. We can't access those accounts until this is resolved through the courts. The accounts are in my wife's name, he said, desperate now. Yes, the banker replied, calm, unmoved. And she's frozen them. Legally. He walked out of the bank and sat in his car for nearly an hour, staring through the windshield at nothing. He wasn't just losing his marriage. He wasn't just losing money. He was losing control. Every direction he turned, Sarah had already been there. The emails? Gone. The cloud storage? Access denied. The passwords he used to manipulate the system? Changed. Claire? Gone. His business accounts? Flagged. And every time he tried to recover something, it led to another closed door, another notification, another quiet reminder that she had outplayed him. He called a lawyer, someone recommended by a mutual friend. The consultation was short. They have documentation? The lawyer asked. Yes, but did you register the business in her name? I didn't think, Michael, the lawyer interrupted. You committed identity fraud. Michael gripped the edge of the desk. She's my wife. That won't hold up. If you forged her signature, used her personal data, rerouted money into a business she never authorized, you're not looking at a civil suit. You're looking at criminal charges. Michael left without hiring him. He tried one more thing, an email to Sarah. Just one line. We need to talk. She didn't respond. Instead, he received a reply from Marianne Doyle, her attorney. Mr. Whitmore, all communication must go through legal counsel. Further attempts to contact our client directly will be considered harassment and reported accordingly. He didn't try again. For the first time in years, Michael was no longer in control of the narrative. He wasn't the man who charmed investors, who manipulated meetings, who shaped stories. He was exposed, discredited, and worst of all, ignored. Sarah wasn't seeking revenge anymore. She had moved past him entirely. The real punishment wasn't the legal consequences. It was irrelevance. That evening, alone in a borrowed guest room at a friend's house, Michael opened his laptop and searched his name online. The wedding story had gone viral. Anonymous guests had leaked parts of the moment. Clips. Photos. A few of the documents had made their way onto forums. One popular blog featured a piece titled, When the Bride's Sister Becomes the Real Story. Michael's name trended for all the wrong reasons. Underneath the article, the comments were brutal. She's a genius. I hope he gets what's coming. This is how you handle betrayal, with receipts. Sarah had stayed silent through it all. And yet, she was louder than he had ever been. It hadn't started with suspicion. It started with noise. Subtle, barely audible noise, an unexpected text tone in the middle of the night, the hushed click of a screen turned off too quickly, the silence after a lie too polished to be real. Sarah had ignored it at first. Or rather, she had chosen not to confront it. But noise, when repeated, becomes rhythm. And rhythm, when persistent, becomes undeniable. Months before the wedding, Sarah had begun to collect the rhythm. The first shift came one afternoon when she noticed an Amazon package addressed to Cascade Meridian Ventures delivered to their home. It wasn't the name that caught her attention, it was the fact that it had her name under the business line. Sarah had never registered a business. She asked Michael casually that evening, sitting at the dinner table, playing with her fork. Do you know what this is? He glanced at it. Oh, that's something from my work. They just used your name for shipping since I was out. She had nodded. And smiled. And said nothing. That night, while Michael slept, she searched the name. Cascade Meridian Ventures was listed as an active LLC in the state of California, registered 18 months earlier. The signature on the filing? Hers. Or rather, a copy of hers. A close one. That was when she called Marianne Doyle for the first time. Before I come in, she said, I need to know if I'm crazy. You're not, Marianne answered before she finished the story. Sarah spent the next 3 weeks combing through Michael's digital footprints, quietly, surgically. She found the sinking issue first. Michael's old iPad, which he had left in the closet after upgrading, was still logged into his cloud. Sarah charged it. Waited. And what unfolded on the screen wasn't a revelation, it was a slow, crawling rot. Emails from Claire. Messages that started distant and became intimate. Notes about transfers, invoices, instructions on how to shield income. Michael had used Claire as both partner and cover, funneling funds through a company Sarah never knew existed, except on paper, where she was the legal owner. She didn't cry. She copied everything. Photos of spreadsheets. Screenshots of messages. PDFs downloaded into a secure folder, stored on 3 separate drives, one of which she mailed to her sister in a plain brown envelope with a note, "Don't open unless I tell you." Then came the credit cards. Sarah pulled her own credit report. 2 open accounts she didn't recognize. Both linked to small, online banking institutions. When she called one to inquire, they verified her identity and asked if she wanted to adjust the credit limit on her business account. She ended the call, fingers trembling, and emailed Marianne that night. Over time, her investigation became a quiet obsession. She found flights, receipts buried in shared email folders, cross-checked with Claire's Instagram posts from anonymous trips. She found an Airbnb reservation Michael had used under a nickname he once joked about using in college. The location matched Claire's tag from 2 days earlier, a weekend retreat in the mountains. She even found a woman, Danielle, a former co-worker of Michael's, who messaged her through LinkedIn out of the blue. "I don't mean to stir anything," Danielle had written, "but I always thought you should know." Michael asked me to lie for him. About Claire. I didn't. But I couldn't say anything back then. "I'm sorry." Sarah thanked her. And added the message to her archive. The past, once exposed, wasn't just a map of betrayal. It was a network of negligence, arrogance, and assumption. Michael had believed in her silence. He had counted on her reluctance to question. And for a while, he'd been right. But Sarah had never been weak. She had been observant. She had been patient. By the time the wedding arrived, she had everything. She knew exactly how much money had passed through her name. She knew every false signature. Every lie. Every piece of data he had stolen. She had enough to build a case. Enough to destroy him. And yet, she waited. Not for vengeance. For clarity. The wedding was symbolic. It was where Michael planned to begin a new story. Sarah chose it to end the old one. And she didn't regret it. In the weeks that followed, friends reached out. Some out of guilt. Some out of curiosity. Sarah responded to none of them. She wasn't interested in defending her silence or explaining her plan. The truth had done that already. Emily, however, became her anchor. "I don't know how you stayed quiet," Emily said one afternoon, sitting across from her at a cafe. "I wasn't quiet," Sarah replied. "I was documenting." Emily shook her head in awe. "He never saw it coming." Sarah looked down at her coffee. That was the point. The past didn't define her anymore. But it was there, etched into her decisions, carved into her discipline. Every text, every file, every night she pretended not to notice, was part of a blueprint. Not for destruction, but for escape. And she had followed it exactly. The courthouse was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that makes every movement sound louder than it should. Sarah sat on the left side of the courtroom, her lawyer to her right, her hands resting lightly on her lap. She wore a dark blue suit, simple, elegant, deliberate. No makeup beyond what was necessary. No jewelry except her wedding ring, which she intended to return before the session ended. Michael entered from the other side. His lawyer looked tired. He looked worse, thinner than before, his once confident posture now caved slightly inward, as if he had aged 10 years in the space of 2 months. He didn't look at Sarah. Not once. The gallery was half full, strangers, bloggers, a few journalists who had followed the story since the wedding night. The case had caught attention beyond their circle. Sarah had not spoken publicly, but the story had spoken for her. The leaked footage, the envelope, the documents. All of it had traveled through whispers and forums until it became something larger than either of them. This was the final act. The judge entered, a tall woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for not tolerating drama. She glanced at the case file, thick with exhibits, and began immediately. Sarah's lawyer started the proceedings by presenting the timeline, the illegal use of her identity, the registration of a business without her consent, the bank accounts, the digital correspondence, and the falsified signatures. Each point was accompanied by proof, documents, recordings, even testimony from the private investigator who had followed Michael and Claire across state lines. Michael's defense tried to claim misunderstanding. They suggested Sarah had been aware but passive. That she had benefited from the accounts indirectly. That the business was a marital asset she was now weaponizing. It didn't work. Sarah had been too thorough. She had emails where she had asked about unexplained charges and received dismissive replies. She had call logs showing Michael deflecting, lying, or changing the subject. She had the incorporation documents showing her forged signature beside Claire's. She had voice recordings of Claire confirming the plan to use Sarah's name as a temporary shell. The courtroom stayed silent through most of it, broken only by the occasional scratch of a pen or the shuffle of paper. Then came the witnesses. Danielle testified via video. Calm. Precise. She confirmed Michael had asked her to cover for him, to pretend Claire was involved in a separate project. She had refused. Her testimony was direct, unimpeachable. A forensic accountant followed, walking the court through how the money had moved, how Sarah's identity was the foundation of the entire financial structure. Her name, her credit, her tax records. Without her, the business would have had no legal standing. That made her not a partner, but a victim. When Sarah finally spoke, the courtroom leaned in. I stayed quiet, she said, because I knew the truth needed to be louder than my anger. I wasn't just betrayed as a wife. I was violated as a citizen. My name, my future, my legal identity, taken from me by someone who once promised to protect it. She looked at Michael, not with hatred, but with something far colder, detachment. He thought I wouldn't find out. That if I did, I wouldn't act. He was wrong on both counts. Michael's response was brief. Hollow. His lawyer spoke more than he did. He apologized vaguely, tried to frame his actions as desperate attempts to escape a failing marriage. Claimed he was manipulated by Claire. That the business was meant to be a fresh start. The judge interrupted. Mr. Whitmore, fraud is not a fresh start. It's a crime. When the ruling came, it was swift. The court granted Sarah a full divorce, immediate and uncontested. All joint assets were to be reviewed, with Sarah retaining the right to seize any funds linked to the fraudulent enterprise. Michael was ordered to pay damages, significant ones, and legal fees. Most importantly, the court confirmed that Michael's actions met the criteria for criminal investigation. His case would now be forwarded to the district attorney. The gavel struck. Court adjourned. Sarah stood, removed her ring, and placed it on the table before leaving the courtroom. Michael stayed seated. Alone. Even his lawyer didn't speak to him. Outside, a few reporters called her name. She walked past them. No statements. No interviews. But as she reached the steps, someone in the crowd clapped, just once. Then another. Then a few more. Not loud. Not theatrical. Just quiet, intentional applause from people who had followed her story and seen it reach its conclusion. Sarah didn't turn around. She didn't need applause. She had something far better. Justice. The money had never mattered to Sarah until it became a weapon used against her. In the months following the court ruling, the assets she once considered background noise, bank accounts, investment portfolios, real estate documents, transformed into the front line of a war she had already won. Now, it was time to clean the battlefield. The first step was the house. The one Michael had tried to transfer to Claire months earlier using forged signatures and a falsified power of attorney. He had underestimated the legal paper trail. Sarah's team filed a motion for immediate injunction and reversal of the deed. The court sided with her. The house returned to her name within 3 weeks. She sold it 2 weeks later. The market was favorable, and with the media coverage surrounding her case, an anonymous buyer made an offer well above asking price. Sarah accepted without hesitation. That house, once filled with fake smiles and half-truths, no longer belonged in her future. Next came the business accounts. Cascade Meridian Ventures was dissolved by court order. The funds within it, nearly $300,000, were frozen and then rerouted to Sarah after the fraud claim was validated. Some of the money had come from legitimate contracts. Most hadn't. Regardless, it had been built on her stolen identity, and now, it belonged to her. She didn't celebrate. She invested. She sat with Marianne and a financial advisor, both of whom she trusted, and began to rebuild with precision. No impulsive purchases. No symbolic gestures of revenge. Just structure. Protection. She set up a trust in her name, then another under a business alias she created for future plans. One meant for something bigger than survival. Michael tried to appeal. He submitted a petition to renegotiate asset division, claiming undue hardship and emotional distress. The court dismissed it within hours. The documentation was too thorough, the evidence too damning. And his public image, once polished and persuasive, had eroded beyond recognition. The press didn't let it go. After the trial, a second wave of attention swept through. Not gossip blogs this time, but investigative podcasts, legal journals, even feminist think pieces. Sarah's story became a case study in silent resistance, strategic planning, and legal empowerment. She never gave interviews, never stepped into the spotlight. But the narrative built itself. Michael's reputation collapsed faster than his bank accounts. Clients severed ties. Friends distanced themselves. No one wanted to be linked to a man under criminal investigation for financial exploitation and identity theft, especially not one who had tried to justify it during his sister-in-law's wedding. He issued an apology online, somewhere between a public relations plea and a pathetic attempt at redemption. I made mistakes. I was in pain. I hurt someone I cared about deeply. It received fewer views than the original video of Sarah handing him the envelope. No one believed him. The real blow came when Claire officially vanished. She was never formally charged, but the whispers followed her. Sarah's anonymous tip to Claire's employer had been just specific enough to make them investigate. She was let go. Quietly. Cleanly. She relocated, deleted social accounts, severed ties. Michael reached out to her once through a mutual friend. She never replied. By autumn, Sarah's financial position was stronger than it had ever been. Not just because of what she recovered, but because of what she had learned. She now understood the systems Michael had abused, and she was using that knowledge to build something far more powerful. She launched an initiative with Marianne and a handful of legal professionals. A discreet consulting program for women who suspected financial betrayal in their marriages or partnerships. Not a nonprofit, not a charity, something in between. It was quiet, selective, and effective. Each woman who came to Sarah had her own version of the same silence Sarah once wore. Sarah didn't offer sympathy. She offered tools. Resources. Introductions to lawyers and investigators. She taught them how to document, how to prepare, how to survive the collapse and still keep the pieces worth saving. It wasn't revenge. It was restoration. One day, while reviewing tax documents with her advisor, he leaned across the table and said, "You do realize, if you wanted to, you could retire." Sarah smiled. "I don't want to." There was too much left to do. At night, in her apartment, a different one now, brighter, with large windows and a view of the city, she sometimes revisited old files. Not to reopen wounds, but to remind herself of the architecture of her escape. Each document, each file, each lie she had turned into proof, was now part of a quiet archive that served as both shield and sword. Michael, by contrast, was now unrecognizable. His final attempt to recover social standing came through a podcast interview he tried to schedule with a sympathetic host. The platform cancelled when word got out. The comments on the announcement had been brutal. The host issued an apology for even considering it. The world had chosen its side. Not because Sarah had told them to, but because, when faced with truth, unfiltered, strategic, undeniable, it was impossible to look away. And Sarah, for the first time in her adult life, was financially untouchable. Sarah never returned to the life she had before. She didn't want to. That version of herself, compliant, accommodating, quietly sacrificing, had stood alone in her new apartment, placing her grandmother's ring into a velvet box and choosing, quietly, to start over. When the reading ended, there was applause. Not loud, not explosive. Just enough. Just honest. Then came the questions. A woman in the back asked what gave her the courage to stay silent for so long. "I wasn't silent," Sarah said. "I was calculating. Some battles aren't won by shouting. They're won by outlasting." Another woman, younger, with a trembling voice, asked if she had forgiven Michael. Sarah thought for a moment before answering. "No," she said. "But I've stopped needing him to carry the weight of what he did. I carry nothing that isn't mine anymore." A man near the door asked if she'd ever go public, TV interviews, podcasts, a Netflix adaptation. She smiled. "I'm not interested in turning truth into entertainment. I've said what I needed to say. The rest belongs to others now." When the event ended, people lingered. They came forward one by one, shaking her hand, thanking her. Some brought copies of her book, dog-eared and underlined, asking for signatures. Others simply nodded, as if to say, "I understand." As the room emptied, Emily walked up last. "You did it," she said. Sarah nodded, her voice low. "We did." Outside, the sky was the deep kind of blue that only comes after rain. The air smelled clean, crisp, like something had been reset. Sarah stood by the window for a long while, watching cars pass, people laugh, leaves blow in little spirals down the sidewalk. A reporter had asked earlier, off the record, if there was anything she would have done differently. Anything she wished she could change. Sarah's answer had been simple. No. That betrayal was the push I needed to live the life I always deserved. She thought about that again as she stepped outside, the cool air brushing her skin. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't even sad. She was steady. Michael's name hadn't crossed her lips in months. She had no idea where he was. And for the first time, she didn't care. Claire remained a ghost, faceless and forgotten. The court case had long since closed. The settlements finalized. The accounts secure. The story written. But Sarah's story, her real story, was just beginning. She walked through the quiet street alone, her pace slow, deliberate. Not in a rush. Not running from anything. Just walking toward what was next. A life of her choosing. A rhythm of her making. And no one, not Michael, not Claire, not the past, could touch it.